I have a Stanley 4.5, which is kind of an unusual plane that I actually like because it's such a heavy brute. So I'm going to do a little bit of a comparison here between it and my Stanley number 4. Thought I'd start out by just weighing these just to show you how heavy this thing is. Here's a normal number 4, and this weighs in at 3 pounds 7 ounces. Here's the 4.5, and it comes in at 4 pounds 10 ounces. It's a brute, as I said. In fact, even a number 5, here's a number 5, weighs in at 4 pounds 5 ounces. So the 4.5 is actually heavier than a number 5. Now this 4.5 that I got was, in not terrible shape. The japanning wasn't the greatest, but the rest of the plane was in pretty decent shape. I needed to do some refinishing of the knob and of the tote, and some cleaning up of some of the parts. And I've gone and polished all of the screws, polished all the brass, polished all the steel to get a kind of a chrome-like finish, sanded a little bit on the frog, and just did this and that. I think it had the wrong knob, so I went to my knob collection and found the right knob. Here is the lever cap. Was actually in really good shape as far as the shape, but as far as the finish, it was a little rough, so I just spent some time lightly sanding it to try to get it down to sort of a uniform silver look and color, and just so it would sparkle just a little bit when the plane was assembled. So it didn't really take a lot of time for me to kind of spruce up. I went about using heavy sandpaper, then lighter sandpaper, and lighter still sandpaper, and then spent a little bit of time on the buffer. And I think I got the lever cap looking pretty nice. As far as the body of the plane, I just did a cleanup. I just used some denatured alcohol with a brush and just kind of swabbed around and cleaned it as best I could. Again, it's missing a lot of japanning, but it's not terrible. And I just kind of polished it up where I could and used some wax on it to give it just sort of a protective coating. The screw heads, I spent some time sanding those. Again, starting with heavy paper. I think I started with 220, went down to 400, then 600, and then spent some time on the buffer. And I honestly got every screw head to pretty much a mirror-like finish. You'll see here a close-up in a second of all those screw heads. The screw for the knob, the 2 screws for the frog, the 2 screws for the tote. I got them all shiny, even the one that holds the chip breaker to the blade. Again, this front knob was incorrect, so I got the correct knob out of my knob collection. It needed some help, so I put it in my drill press and spent some time sanding down the surface. The sander worked pretty well. I rubbed a little dark stain on it to get it close to the color that I think it would have been on the original plane, even though I think this knob and this tote are beech rather than rosewood, so they are a lighter wood, but I put some dark stain on them, and I think they took it very nice with a little bit of oil stain and then a coat or 2 of wax. I think I got the knob and the tote looking pretty good. The finish on the tote was a little more stubborn, and it didn't come off quite as easy. I found myself using lacquer thinner with a brush. So I would soften the finish a little bit with lacquer thinner, use a scraper on it, scrape the part that would loosen up, apply more lacquer thinner, and I just kept doing this over and over again. Honestly, the lacquer thinner alone, if you just had enough patience and would brush it on and leave it for a bit and then brush it again, the lacquer thinner alone would finally take off this finish. So between that method of just painting on lacquer thinner and using a scraper, then a little bit later I soaked some steel wool in lacquer thinner and would burnish it with the steel wool soaked in lacquer thinner. And you can see I got right down to the beach, actually very cleanly. I got the tote to be just down to the wood. And honestly, this tote is in really good shape. I had to sand a little bit of rough edges off of it, but honestly, the tote is in really, really good shape. So once I got it down to the wood, using the lacquer thinner method and a little bit of light sanding to clean it up and to kind of level things out, I used the same dark stain that I used on the knob to give it a uniform color. And then I put a couple of coats of wax on it to give it a nice sheen and just make it feel good in your hand. And I think the finished product of both the knob and the tote look really good. They're whole, there's no cracks or splits, and they both feel really good and look really good, and I think they look as kind of original as I could get. As far as the plane itself, the frog, I spent a little time just sort of sanding down the mating surfaces of the frog, just kind of trying to make sure I'd get a nice, even, tight fit between the blade and the frog surface. I'm not sure it needed this at all, but it wasn't that hard to just spend a little time sanding that to kind of clean up those mating surfaces where the blade rests against the frog. You can see it looks pretty decent once I got that sanded. Then I took my sander and just kind of sanded these edges. This plane, the casting is so thick because this thing is so heavy that those edges, to get those shiny, I just thought looked nice. And so I spent a little time on those upper edges, just kind of shining those up to make them look a little bit better. The casting on this thing just weighed a ton. I then pencil marked all across the bottom and spent just a few minutes rubbing this on some sandpaper to see if it was way out of level and way out of flat. And it wasn't bad at all, just a few strokes, and I noticed all my pencil marks were gone, even in the center. So it was a pretty decently flat plane from the get-go. So all I had to do is just a little bit of this, a little bit of cleanup, put a coat of wax on that to make it slippery and to preserve it for rust protection. And I think it's going to be a really nice user of a plane. Again, I usually put wax on with steel wool. I'm not positive that's necessary, but I just tend to do that to just give it a little bit of a burnishing and then a little bit of buffing. And honestly, it's slick, shiny, and smooth. Slides really nice. Very little friction on the bottom. Spent a little time on the blade. The blade was not quite 90 degrees with the world, so I spent a little time with some heavy paper and a guide to kind of flatten that bevel across its width. Then I went to some lighter paper and then some lighter paper still. This is an old piece of glass that I have some automotive paper stuck to, super light, I think maybe 2000 grit paper. And then I finished up the blade on my diamond stone, and I got it scary sharp. It was nice and square and nice and sharp. Generally with a 4.5, well, I did it flat. I'm using it like a smoother. So here I am putting a coat of wax on the knob and a coat of wax on the tote. And I'm about to put this plane back together again. Give those just a nice polish and then go ahead and reassemble the plane. The 4.5 is wider as well as heavier. It's a little bit longer than a 4. You'll see these next to each other in a minute. It's quite a bit wider than a 4. And It works great for a smoother because it just kind of wants to sit flat on the wood, number one. And number two, again, I'm a big believer in inertia. I think a heavy plane, I think it's the whole principle of once you get that plane moving, it's less likely to stop and it's more likely to power its way through the wood. And if you've got it nice and sharp, that inertia helps. So it being a heavy brute, and again, 4 pounds, 10 ounces, it's a heavy, heavy plane. But if you got it deadly sharp, you'll see here in a minute as I plane with it, it's a pleasure to plane with because just nothing slows it down. I just kind of adjusted it here, just tried it on the edge of this board. This is a piece of cherry, so it's pretty hard wood. You can see I'm getting some really nice, look at those nice curls that are coming off of there. It just glided over this wood. Again, trouble-free, no catching, no dragging. Little dramatic slow-mo here to show you the nice curls of wood that were coming off of the edge of that piece of cherry. A really nice plane to use, 4.5. They're kind of rare, so finding one, your best bet would probably be eBay. But I got lucky with this one and found it at a estate sale where a guy had a bunch of stuff for sale. So there's the, on the edge of a board, I tried it as a smoother. I didn't block this board down very well, so it kind of was wiggling on me, but I used it as a smoother. It had very rough grain, and I used it just right along the grain, holding the plane at a slight angle, and I'll tell you, it worked great as a smoother, smoothing out the surface of that piece of wood, and I got a really, really nice surface out of it. Again, just using it as a smoother. You can see, look at the curl I'm getting off of that wood. So there it is, finished. The Stanley 4.5. There's a side view of it, and there it is next to a number 4, just to give you a size comparison. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please subscribe, and thank you for watching.